And so in some ways, we using these LLMs and seeing their use cases, we're identifying all the parts of human life that are actually completely meaningless. But if you try to get it to make something cool, it just can't do it, because what it's doing is averaging every song in the world and just pumping out, well, here's how songs usually sound. And what you realize is art and culture, it's always somebody understanding the conventions of the time and intentionally going against them and doing something else that creates the thing that is fresh and cool. And that's what people want out of culture. They don't want repetition all the time. And different people want different levels of innovation and experimentation. But overall, when culture stagnates and it's just the same thing over and over again, people get bored. And so I think using AI, you start understanding these human phenomena a lot better.
Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrisey, where we share insights from great thinkers. Today I'm excited to be joined by David Marx, an American writer based in Japan, author of Amatora, How Japan Saved American Style, and his latest book, Status and Culture, as well as someone who has held leadership communications positions at companies as large as Google. David, konnichiwa, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have a conversation about what we can learn about humans' relationship with status and culture. But before we do that, for you, there's always been a connection with Japan. At Harvard, you wrote and studied East Asian studies and wrote a senior thesis on the Japanese fashion brand A Bathing Ape, which had a big rise, 20 years ago or so. What initially captured your attention about East Asian culture and the Japanese?
Yeah, so I grew up in Pensacola, Florida, and Pensacola happened to have a sister city connection to a small town in the mountains in Japan. And, normally these connections don't mean very much, but I got to go to Japan when I was 17. And I was very interested in alternative music, culture, indie film, things like that. And it started to drag a bit in 1996, kind of post Cobain killing himself, and the whole thing kind of got a little bit boring and was just bored basically. And when I got to Japan, it was fascinating to see this completely alternative world of culture that was quality and development wise equal, if not surpassing, the United States in many ways. And no one really had seen much of Japanese culture at that point other than the Stray anime show that was on TV, or, a film like Akira or something. But, there was just all this going on with really contemporary pop culture, and it was exciting. And there was, music that was referencing electric light orchestra and things that were very out of mode in the United States. And so I went to school and decided to study Japanese, and was just fascinated with kind of this idea that Japan was a futuristic culture. And, at the time, the East Asian Studies departments had been built on studying East Asia as kind of its tradition and history. And then in the 80s, but when the Japanese economy got so good, people were studying it for business reasons. And I got there as all of that was kind of collapsing, and was one of the first people interested in Japan as a cultural leader rather than kind of a different cultural heritage. And so, after me, I think a lot of people showed up who were anime and manga fans and things like that. But when I was there, I was kind of a bit of a weirdo in trying to study contemporary Japanese pop culture and consumer culture. And in 98, I went to Japan to do an internship, and that's where I discovered Japanese street fashion. And I think the thing that was interesting to me was it did absolutely seem more advanced and much more just intense than what was going on in the United States, in that people were waiting in line hours to buy t-shirts, and that there was the whole reseller culture that didn't really exist in the US. And it was all around casual garments like jeans or t-shirts and all that. And so, I had just never seen anything like it. And as I talked to my professors about it, just, from a what do you think's going on here, they encouraged me to study it. And so it was, a personal interest that became an academic interest. And that really got me interested in this kind of whole stream of things that I look at and write about, which is how culture works. And I think fashion, I was not someone who grew up interested in fashion at all. And it's been interesting to see fashion go from something quite niche to, I think, for young people today, a really big part of their culture.
Yeah, specifically on Bathing Ape, it seems like that was like a real icon of and representation of what was going on in the culture. Like what was behind the virality of a brand like that?
So when I encountered A Bathing Ape in '98, what was interesting to me, I think, somewhat subconsciously, was that it was completely unavailable outside of Japan. So you more or less had to go to Japan to get your hands on it. And so there was a bunch of people in the US and UK who were obsessed with it because it was so hard to get. And The Face, which is a British magazine in 1999, called it truly underground because just nobody could get their hands on it. And then in 2003, Pharrell Williams went to Japan for the first time, and he hooked up with Bathing Ape head honcho Nigo, and they have this partnership that's still in existence today. But that really brought A Bathing Ape directly into hip hop culture in the United States. Kanye starts wearing it, Lil Wayne starts wearing it, Pusha T. I think Pusha T and Lil Wayne have like a rivalry around who wore it first, and so suddenly Japanese streetwear is just in the heart of American hip hop, which is probably the most dominant form of culture in the United States at that point. And so then Bape becomes a giant American phenomenon and then a global phenomenon. And so really, I was interested in it when it was very obscure, and then suddenly I went to, I think this was probably '06 or something. I was in Pensacola, Florida, where I grew up, and I went to a shopping mall, and there was kind of a one of these dead spaces in the mall that isn't really run by a branded store. That was just kind of a fly by night operation, and they just had a giant wall of fake Bathing Ape, and I was like, wow, like it just, the fact that this has come to Pensacola, Florida, blows my mind. So it was a huge transformation from about the year 2000 to the year 2006 or so for the brand, but it was 100% because of its adjacency to what was going on in hip hop.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about like culture. How do you think about the connection between fashion and culture?
So it's really important in that fashion is the most pure expression of culture in some ways. So if you think about the culture of the iPhone, so there's almost this unbelievable bias towards iPhones in the United States, and it's very easy to say, well, the iPhone is just a better phone. It has this function that's better. And what's interesting about fashion is because it's so clearly arbitrary that pants don't necessarily need to have wide legs or skinny legs or whatever. There's these minor differences in functionality between them, but you see these changes over time and they're arbitrary. It's really a way to understand this part of human life that nobody thinks about. And one of the things I try to do really hard is to get people to take fashion seriously as a view on human beings, because there's just too much dismissal of it from people in the hard sciences or economics or whatever because it is frivolous. But because it's frivolous, it's a really important view on human beings. And so if you think about human beings, there are obviously we have instincts and we have these rational behaviors. And I think you look at economics really wants to think about humans as rational beings. I think behavioral economics is trying to change that a little bit. But there's this middle category between instinct and rationality, which I would call conventionality, which is the human beings just decide amongst themselves that certain things have value. And animals can't do this and robots can't do this. Only humans can do it. It's really the most human thing that we can do. And all of language and symbol and culture and art is all based off of this process. And so fashion is a really good way to distill this process to its most ridiculous side because it is so arbitrary. And if you look at how fashion trends spread and you look at some of those processes, I think it just gives you a much better view on social change, cultural change, and all those things, rather than looking at social change or cultural change as in some sort of instinctual process, which is not, and it's most certainly not a rational process. Or even I just wrote a review of the new Malcolm Gladwell book, but thinking about cultural and social change as a disease epidemic model also doesn't make any sense. And so the only way to really understand that process is to look at the human how human beings kind of create symbols. And I think that fashion is a really good way to do that.
Yeah, when you were talking about the arbitrary nature of fashion, I was thinking about how maybe still today, but I know up until a few years ago, the British Parliament still wore wigs, which is
Right.
just like completely arbitrary.
Right. I mean, ritual, and that's the thing too, is I think in the 20th century, we got more and more uncomfortable with ritual and more uncomfortable with tradition or custom that aren't anchored in really clear practical benefits. And so there's been this erasure of all ritual as if it's like, oh, that's a ridiculous part of life. And, if you think about people's clothing, for example, in the 90s, things got very casual. You didn't have suits in the business in business environments anymore. But what that does is open up people to look at suits again and say, oh, people just look really good in these older forms of clothing. Or, hey, maybe British Parliament is kind of interesting that they have this ritual or whatever it is. And so there is a cultural value that is not a rational value. It's not about practicality at all, but this value exists among human beings. And by being snobbish or seeing fashion as a regrettable part of human life, I think just makes people blind to it. And I think it's a major problem in social science, which is that everyone just kind of ignores this topic because they don't like it or they don't have any personal experience with it. And so therefore it's like, well, this is not a part of human life if I don't understand it.
Yeah. When you were sharing that, I was thinking about Guy Ritchie. Guy Ritchie wears a suit all day. It's like his suit of armor, and it's an orientation that he puts on that he's ready to play. He's ready to go out and on his day. I first found your work through Thorstein Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class. How did you first find that book in the process of your research and then ultimately writing Status and Culture?
So I took a class in college. I think my sister was looking through the syllabus or something my junior year. She's like, "Oh, you should take this class." She worked in advertising and marketing, and it was the social underpinnings of taste. And this
That's a
was
good one.
that was my introduction to all of this, and it was a really great class. And we had an introduction to Veblen, and Veblen's main idea in the book is a little bit more nuanced than I think he gets summarized. But
Mhm.
Theory of the Leisure Class more or less introduces this idea of conspicuous consumption, which is more or less that people, when they make a lot of money, but they don't necessarily have a name and honor and esteem, they use that money to go uh, transfer the money into esteem, into status. And the way you do that, the easiest way to do it is if you buy expensive things that show that you can pay for expensive things. It means you must have money. And this is a very universal idea. I think it exists in almost every culture in which you have these economic conditions. It is why new money has the kind of aesthetic that they do. And for Veblen, he looks at conspicuous waste, which is another way that kind of in pre-consumer societies, you had people uh, show off how much power and money they had by just like burning things to the ground or having banquets that have so much food that nobody can eat it. But in a consumer society, you can do that by buying a really expensive car to show that you can buy a very expensive car. And I think Veblen is a starting point for thinking about how aesthetics link to social position, but it's definitely not the end point. And even Veblen in the book says, look, if you have a society in which you start having all this new money, but then the new money settles and you get some old money, what you'll see is a little bit of the opposite, which is that people who have had money for a long time will start not being flamboyant.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that dynamic is also really important. So other authors have covered this idea. And if you think about money as a signal, so I'm going to buy a $200,000 car to show that I can pay for a $200,000 car, and that's the signal. Then what happens is you get counter signaling, which is that people who have a lot of money who have had a lot of money for a long time and they have a name and a reputation, they can start driving a worse car to counter the signals, to say more or less, if you are somebody who's buying a really fancy car, it must mean you just came into money and therefore you have less status than me, who has had money for a very long time. So old money old money style is very different than new money because of this social relation and social position. And I think those two, just kind of new money versus old money alone, gives you a sense of that connection between status and culture. And most certainly in thinking about these famous theories is where the idea for the book came from, in that every time, in graduate school, I also studied a lot of this, and it was always presented as Veblen says this, but then Zimmel says this, but then Bourdieu says this. And to me, it was like, well, these are all parts of the human experience that make sense. Why is there not a book that just tries to find the common thread between all of them? Just like, what are the Lego pieces in which you can start building infrastructure and then all of them lay on top and all make sense. And so that's what I wanted to do with the book, is to provide the building blocks for a theoretical framework that makes all these things make sense, rather than put them in contrast, because I don't think they're in contrast at all. I think they all tell the same story.
Yeah, I really liked in the earlier portion of the book, you tell a story about Lee Trevino, who, if folks aren't familiar, was a golfer. And he's talking about, like, when he wasn't good, no one would laugh at his jokes. When he got good and popular, his jokes didn't change at all, but his reception certainly did.
Right. And, you're seeing that now with Elon Musk, who is in a room surrounded by people who are laughing at his jokes all the time, and then he puts them on Twitter and he gets a very different response. And so, this, that different context is dangerous also when you don't know how to read it.
Yeah. What do people need to know about status and culture and how it influences our desires?
So, I think it's really useful for anyone to know this. And even if you read my book and don't agree with my thesis, like I think I introduced a lot of concepts and a lot of words that can be useful for just understanding yourself and how society works. But, one thing is, there's kind of a popular phrase these days about status games, that we're all kind of running around playing these games. And I really disagree with that, in that I just think status is so buried in the human experience. It's like the undergirding for everything that we do, that it's a little ridiculous to think about it as a game, because a game is something you can walk away from, or that you play sometimes, but not all the time. And status affects all of us, and it infects the aesthetics that we have. And so when we think something is cool, that is a status judgment, even though we don't necessarily think it is. It's always done in the context of saying, oh, this is cool because it's associated with people who are cool, and it's not associated with people who are uncool, or whatever it is. And so it's almost impossible to have a aesthetic judgment that's completely free of status. And I think that's the thing to kind of understand. And obviously everybody can make their own choices, and they're not completely bound to the system, but to understand at least the first principles of how your aesthetics are formed, and how your background and the particular situation you're in affects the way you see the world and the way that you make these judgments, I think is important, even if it's for you to move away from it or make changes or whatever it is. And so, the book's not in any way a guide to getting more status, or it's not a polemical book about how we should stop caring about status, but it's very much, I think everyone should understand the processes, and then we can make judgments as society about, are we giving status to the right people? Are we, organizing arts and culture in a way that it maximizes innovation in those fields? It used to be that sometimes status naturally would advocate for experimental and innovative art, and now it doesn't, for a variety of reasons I'm writing about in a new book. But so we can't make those judgments as a society. We can't think about it unless we know how the processes work. And so that's the point of the book.
Yeah, awesome. No, I really enjoyed it. Do you have a favorite story that you typically recount when you think about the book that you think illustrates your thesis?
I mean, every chapter starts with a different anecdote, and they're all from a giant range of sources and eras. And one that my editor said is the craziest one in the book is the way I talk about status symbols, were these harvest store grain silos, these giant blue grain silos in the Midwest. And they weren't necessarily the best grain silos, but they were the most expensive grain silos. And so the really wealthy farmers would get these giant blue silos that you could see from quite far away because they were kind of eyesores. But it showed that you were a more successful farmer than other farmers because you had one of these. And, just I think people understand status. When you use the word status colloquially, people will think it means something like, he cares about status. He's trying to be better than other people. And what I'm trying to show is that status is just a neutral judgment of your social position, and that every single society on earth has some sort of hierarchy. And it doesn't matter if you're a farmer or in New York City, the behavior, the things you buy are all based off of some sort of position jockeying, even if that means everyone around you is doing something and you're trying to do the same thing. That's also thinking about position. So, and the thing is, the biggest critique, obviously, for all of this is that someone will say, well, not me. I don't do any of that. I don't care about status. I just like buy what I like. And, not only do I think that, again, unconsciously and subconsciously, all of your aesthetics are borrowed from society that cares about these things. But culture doesn't need necessarily to have every single person participating in doing this mechanism the way I'm describing it for culture to move. I mean, what's interesting about, you think about a disease, COVID or something needs to reach this critical mass before you think about it as a problem. A fashion trend probably affects something like, I don't know, well, less than 1% of people on Earth, and it's a fashion trend, right? Like, okay, so the Adidas Samba is back. I mean, are we really talking about, less than 1% of human beings probably own these shoes, and it's a fashion trend. And so culture doesn't ever need to involve every single person doing the right things. It just needs enough to create these dynamics. And so, you yourself, yes, you are an absolute saint, and you don't care about any of this stuff, and you're above it. But enough people in the world are following these principles in order to make culture change. But again, back to the harvestors, there's no way to understand harvestors without understanding the status implications of why people were buying them.
Yeah, a big theme was how status and culture is impacted by feedback loops and access. And you mentioned how the internet has changed everything. What have you observed?
So kind of two things started happening, or a multitude of things started happening in the 21st century around culture. And there's a sense of cultural stasis where things have really felt like they've slowed down. And the new book I'm writing, which is a cultural history of the 21st century, is going in a chronological order to try to figure out exactly when these changes happen. And it's not all because of the internet. The internet most certainly exacerbated a lot of problems. And so what I was trying to look at is, if you can identify all these status and culture mechanisms that are between human beings, what happens when the internet changes the parameters of those mechanisms? And so a really clear one, when I was growing up, if you to hear about a cool band was quite difficult. You had to know, especially in my hometown, we did not have a cool radio station for a long time because Pensacola, Florida was not big enough to sustain one. And so to hear about a cool band, you had to somewhat hear about it from your friend's older brother or something. It was like a person by person kind of connection. And then to get the CD from the cool band, you had to know someone, or it had to exist at the few record stores that existed. And so information was scarce, and distribution of goods was quite rare or difficult. And so that created cool things because they were exclusive, and rarity and scarcity are really important for creating cultural value. So that was going on in the 90s. Now in an internet age, you can find out about almost anything instantly. If it used to be an expert on something, you had to read a book or go to the library or whatever it was, and now Wikipedia provides it within seconds. More importantly, even if you aren't an expert and you go off and get expertise, people just assume that expertise can be created very easily. So the credit you get for the expertise, even if you read all the books and put all the time in, I think is less than it's ever been. There's way less scarcity of information. And then the internet, just by the nature of e-commerce, makes everything available to anybody. in a way that most certainly did not exist 30 years ago. So just those two factors alone really devalue a lot of what has been called cultural capital, which is, being able to show you have status by knowing the right things or owning the right objects. I think that has been diminished, and it doesn't mean that people stop status signaling. It means that money just has much more power because money is still money after all these years. And so that's just one example. There's, in the book I talk about a lot of different ways the internet has impacted status signaling and what the results are, but just information and goods being more available has had a massive impact.
Yeah, something I've seen is I graduated college like 10, 11 years ago, and just like thinking about spheres of influence. Like Instagram was just starting to be a thing, like maybe my senior year, like, and like seem to have like these like distinct cultures. Like from like a fashion standpoint, I went to Miami University in the Midwest. Like we were wearing oversized button downs and stuff. It was pretty rough in retrospect, but like I remember I moved to Dallas, Texas, and went to an SMU football game in like 2016, and like I thought I was at Coachella. And like from like my viewpoint, like just kind of like observing, it seems like it's gotten much more homogenized, and you're not even just competing with your own group or sphere of influence. Now you're competing on like the world stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And even Instagram at the very beginning, I remember it used to be called the happiest place on the internet because Facebook had become so much about showing off how perfect your life was. And people were abandoning it to go to Instagram because Instagram was just these Polaroid, like, it was founded because smartphone cameras were so bad that they're like, we can create these filters and borders to make your photos look fun, like Polaroids. And so at the very beginning, it was just a bunch of creative class people doing abstract photos, or here's like something in my life, or whatever it was. But it was not about showing off at all. I mean, it was showing off almost like it was counter signaling, and that people were like, look at me, I'm not showing off. And then something happened where suddenly all the people, all the strivers and influencers kind of showed up, and they're like, look at me, I'm in Italy, look at this pool. And then obviously, because they're showing off stuff, every company in the world was like, well, this is incredible. We can pay these people who are very popular to show off our products and, just show the products. And none of them have any kind of impulse to say no. And so now you have this whole influencer industry. And that continued for a while and created this real Instagram look that, as you said, connected the entire world. And so people, I write in the book about Tuva, which is an area of Russia that's next to Mongolia that used to be famous as like basically the most obscure place in the world. There's a whole book that Richard Feynman wrote about trying to go there because it was so hard to get there. And if you look at Tuva, you just see people living this Instagram life the way that everyone else does. And so the world is connected, and everyone is signaling, and everyone's competing on the same platform in a way that just never existed before. And so obviously that's another major distortion of how culture happens.
Yeah, you also see like I had a guest a couple weeks ago named Matty Moe. He's on the internet as the most famous artist, and he was one of the first people. He worked with Alfred Coffee Shop in Los Angeles to draw murals on their walls, and they figured out like people would take selfies with it, and it drove business and drove ad opportunities for like the Alfred coffee sleeves. So it's interesting to see what's happened like in new restaurants. It's almost like some of these places are just built for Instagram and internet virality.
Yeah, and then the question is, does that position them as somewhere middle in the status chain rather than the top? Because somewhere at the top, we don't need to
Exactly.
do any of those things,
Yeah.
right? And so, these are all just kind of universal principles that I'm trying to lay out in the book. I mean, it's also fascinating to me the degree to which the pink wall in Los Angeles at the Paul Smith shop is now like a landmark. I'm pretty sure in Google Maps, if you put pink wall, it'll take you
Yeah.
right there in West Hollywood. But that it's also just like a groan inducing kind of place as well. And so, it's the internet, it gives and it takes.
Yeah. Um, you talked a little bit about like people moving against ritual and people moving against formality. That's something I'm watching too. Like especially like you have also a disillusion of social groups too. Like people have less of a need for ethnic groups and religious groups, etc. these days, which I think puts some element of risk if economic times go south. But what have you learned about status and culture that play into your worldview around the ingredients for a meaningful life?
Um,
And the reason I ask that question
yeah.
is because often when you think about status, you do see some people appearing to play a status game or a little bit of a rat race, and it seems like it's accelerated with some of these things.
I mean, most certainly, I think there's some easy uh, cautionary tales with status. I once asked an emergency, like an ER doctor, okay, you worked in the ER for a long time. What are the few behaviors that you would say you should avoid to not show up in the ER? And it was like, don't ever ride a motorcycle, don't do drugs, don't drink too much. I mean, it was very simple. And I think the rules of status are kind of the same, which is once you learn, okay, there's never a point of status in which you're satiated, which is different than money. With money, after you make a certain amount, and I think economists have tried to figure this out, it's like $75,000 or $80,000 a year, or whatever it is. You reach a level of comfort in which, after that point, you're not really buying goods for comfort; you're buying it more or less for status. And so the thing to understand about status is it doesn't matter how high you go up, there's always higher, and you'll never settle down. And so, like, I think understanding that is important because it just makes you a little bit more introspective of like, okay, why am I doing this thing? Am I really dissatisfied? Do I really need to move up? So I think there's some basic contours around understanding status that help you uh, get rid of, I don't want to call them false needs, but to at least not think that you're going to ever be happy with some level of achievement, or to look at your level of achievement and say, okay, actually this was what I set out to do. Let's stop the mission creep where it's like, well, now I got to do this and this and this and this. But you look at someone like George Clooney, who is one of the most famous actors in the world and surely has a lot of money from being a top actor, but needed to make a tequila brand and made all this money from that, or has to do these Nespresso commercials or whatever it is. I mean, you get a sense also that no one is ever satisfied. And so I think the one lesson for a meaningful life probably is at least to understand that mechanism of satisfaction and status, and to know that status is not going to be the thing that ever satisfies you. I would say some level of success at least gets the chip off of your shoulder. That's like an important thing. But after that, it always goes up. And so at the same time, I don't think you can escape it. I don't think being a monk somewhere is necessarily the thing you need to do. I feel the way about status and cultures that I feel about language, which is that every word that we use, more or less, we got from somewhere else. We did not make up that word. And it is incumbent on us to recombine all of these things that society gives us to create an identity. But the medium we're using is provided by society. And the same with status and culture, which is society is going to provide you with the context and the aesthetics and the values and all these things, and then it's up to you to use them in a way that works for you. But I don't think rejecting all of it is necessarily the solution either.
Awesome. You did a lot of your writing while holding relatively high positions at places like Google. What was that like for you, balancing the career and some of the other book writing and work you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, I would get up in the morning and write, and then go to work. And it really is this magic trick. But if you write an hour and a half every morning, and maybe a little bit on the weekends, you can write a book in a year. And if you do it right. And I commuted on a train, and so I would read on the train and then take notes and then put the notes. I'd come home and put the notes in. Um, I would say it's doable. It was really important for me to have both things happening, or otherwise, if I only did writing, I would starve. And if I only
Mhm.
did a
Yeah.
corporate job, I would go crazy. And so having both of those was really important for me. I think there's a nice synergy at some point where I was learning a lot of um, techniques about just how to be organized and professional at work. And then I was learning a lot about storytelling that I could bring back to my job. So that worked very well. I would say doing it for a prolonged amount of time in which I was never relaxing, because every moment, I think especially with a book, every moment you're like, well, I could use this 30 minutes to read an additional thing or to write or to edit. Never relaxing is probably not good. And so when you do two jobs at once, even if it's elective like that, there's the really high possibility of burnout. And so uh, I'm pretty torn on it, which is, it would be great if I could only do writing, because that's the thing I'm passionate about and really like doing it. And I feel some impact in the world from that. But at the same time, it's just difficult. I think the vast majority of writers can't just be writers. And so you've got to find a balance, and uh, everyone will have their own way of doing that. I mean, I think one thing that people sometimes try is, I want to write as my passion, but I also want to write as my job. And I think that's actually that's a formula that does not work for me at all, because I have 2 or 3 hours in my day where I can write. And so if I spend any of that on work, it takes away from the book. And so I'd worked at CNN for a little bit and found that my writing output was definitely going down, because I just couldn't, there's only so much writing I can do. And so, for me, like having a job that's a little bit off. I mean, obviously I was doing some writing at work, but not just being not going in and pumping out 1,500 words at work every day, and also 1,500 words on the book or whatever it is. I think I couldn't do that, but I could definitely do a job that was in some ways a little more not related to writing.
I think it's a really inspiring story. I think the over glorify, going all in on something. And I think a hybrid approach makes a ton of sense in this day and age.
I think there's a big debate about this. And unfortunately, the image is still very much, if you're a musician or artist, that you should, be putting your entire life and soul into that and not doing anything else. And it's just not a possibility for most people. And I think it's quite, unfair, because it also then tips the scales to people who come from means. If you have a trust fund, then you can do whatever you want, for example. And so if you don't have a trust fund, you have to find some means to pay the bills. And then you have to, you make these, whether the compromises or just, specific tactical decisions in your life. And I think it's important not to stigmatize, people for the fact that they may have to do jobs. And there's a British music critic, party promoter, Elijah, that I'm friends with, whose whole thing is, stop demonizing the fact you have a job. If you work in the music industry, you also have to have a job. It's just the way it works. Stop. Like, we need to normalize this. And so I think there is this movement now to understand that a little bit better.
I completely agree. And I think it's really timely too. It's like most people have to have jobs, the overwhelming majority, and it's not a bad thing. I think there's a lot of things you could, like you said, you can learn and grow and apply into your passions, etc. Can you speak a little bit to your view on the role of long-term writing, not just for writers, but potentially everyone in a ChatGPT world? I just saw, I think they just had like 11 million paid subscribers and a lot more, probably endless amount of unpaid subscribers. And I just kind of see like the early innings of like dwindling intellectual rigor. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that trend.
I mean, there are certainly a lot of famous writers who have no intellectual rigor either, who aren't using LLMs. So it's not all the LLM's fault. But I mean, I have two specific views on this. One is, I can't use these for what I do, because I'm looking always for these hyper specific details. And the problem with an LLM is they'll just hallucinate all of these. Mm-hmm. And so I'll give you a very specific example, which really blew my mind. But I was in China, and I was in Shanghai, and I stumbled into where there's a museum, kind of the birthplace of communism, and there's a little gift shop, and they had these books from a magazine where the Japanese pronunciation of the characters would be Shinseinen, which means new youth. And I knew that Japan also had a magazine called the same thing at the same time. And I was like, oh, this is very interesting. So China in the 1910s had this magazine called New Youth. And so did Japan. Like, which one was first? Did they know that they were both doing it? So I looked it up and I could not find very many good articles on this in Google. I knew that the China one was first, and that's about it. And then I asked Gemini, like the Google Chat GPT, uh, did the Japanese version of this magazine take influence from the Chinese one? It was like, absolutely. And it gave me this beautiful 800-word answer with all these specific details about like this person was influenced by this person and all that. I was like, well, this is exactly what I was looking for. This is great. And then it had a new feature where it was like, check this answer. And so I hit the check this answer button and the entire thing came back red. I mean, it hallucinated all of it. And so, in looking for quotes and looking for leads, you spend more time double checking what you're getting out of these systems than is worth it. It's just better for me to do a normal search through books and articles and magazines, not to use these. I mean, that maybe get better, but that just turned me off from, I've been burned enough times where I got
Yeah.
something, I was like, wow, this is beautiful, and then turned out to be completely fake. So I think that's one issue. And the second, I've seen people I saw somebody write a recommendation letter for somebody using ChatGPT. And I thought it was really interesting because it's like, yeah, this is a really good use case, which is a recommendation letter is just pablum. It's just mostly padding. And you get it to do your first draft and you go through and you add a couple things and then great. So you've really saved time. But what you realize is it's really good at writing pablum and writing bureaucratic words that don't mean anything and aren't taken to mean anything. And so in some ways, we using these LLMs and seeing their use cases, we're identifying all the parts of human life that are actually completely meaningless, like corporate email. And so the idea of like, oh, we'll write your corporate emails for you, and then we'll have an AI read the corporate emails for you and summarize. Well, it's like, well, you're showing that we're spending all this time and effort doing something that basic is meaningless in the first place. So I think it's good. I really think AI is at this point, I don't know how useful it is in a direct sense, but it's incredibly useful for showing human beings how culture works, and it's not exactly the same as a creative process, but it shows you where the creative process comes from. And so, I'll give you another example, which is Suno, which is a AI that makes songs. And you put in a prompt, say, I want a new metal song with these lyrics, and it pumps out in 30 seconds like a 2-minute song. And they're not bad. They're songs. I mean, it's really impressive in how much it sounds like a pop song. Now, is it good? Different question. But if you try to get it to make something cool, it just can't do it, because what it's doing is averaging every song in the world and just pumping out, well, here's how songs usually sound. And what you realize is art and culture, it's always somebody understanding the conventions of the time and intentionally going against them and doing something else that creates the thing that is fresh and cool. And that's what people want out of culture. They don't want repetition all the time. And different people want different uh, levels of innovation and experimentation. But overall, when culture stagnates and it's just the same thing over and over again, people get bored. And so I think using AI, you start understanding these human phenomena a lot better. And so from that point of view, I think it's cool that these things exist and that we're using them. I just, in terms of being a writer, I'm just going to put in some stuff and it's going to pump out a story. Well, you're not really doing the writing. I mean, it's kind of like I was doing Japanese archery kyudo for the first time last year, just to kind of to do it. And it's like, yeah, you can make a machine that shoots the arrow. It's like, what's the point? The point is to go through the process and to go through the ritual. And so, to me, it's like if I'm not doing the writing, I don't get what the point of trying to be a writer is.
Yeah. What have you learned just about, when you were talking about the Japanese archery, it got me thinking about Japanese culture and how there's like these very traditional through lines in a very, very hyper modern society.
Yeah.
What stands out to you?
Just especially being from the United States and a culture founded on more or less Protestant Christian values, it's so much about process. Protestant Christianity is all about the human individual relationship with God. You don't really need a church. You just need this personal relationship, and the process and the ritual doesn't matter as much. And in Japan, it is a culture in which ritual matters a lot, and I think the influence there is from Confucianism, which is all about ritual. And it's not necessary that everything always ties back to some sort of uh, philosophical or religious framework, but for whatever reason, process really, really matters in Japan. And so you, for a long time, Japan was very good at hardware and things that needed to be high quality because this process really ensures high quality. And the knock against Japan was it's not as creative, because if you're process oriented, creativity is anathema at the very beginning. It can happen at the end when it's like you have a master for 40 years has mastered the process and now it's making a small tweaks, but it's not an immediate thing. Where in the United States, being, I think there's a pressure as a musician artist, like you need to make original things ASAP. Don't like go learn from the masters and then later, 20 years later, make changes. So in Japan, the process in a software era and a creativity era 20 years ago was seen as, well, this is a big drag on Japanese culture because it can't create startups and do all these creative things because it's too process oriented and things have to be the way that things were. And that may have been true, but it's interesting now that everything in the United States seems to be done for expediency and profit, and a lot of the quality of services has gotten worse. And it's interesting to be in Japan because it is still a very analog place. Digital culture never really took off the same way it did in the US. And all of these analog material things are made with a lot of craft and care. And so the experience of going to a restaurant or going to a cafe or buying physical goods is just a much better, more pleasant, elevated, superior experience than what you get in places in which it's just like the entire point is just to give you a thing and to take money for it. That's it. And so that through line, as you said, of process orientation and detail orientation and ritual, for a long time, it did seem to be a disadvantage for Japan. And now I think in a world in which we went too digital too fast and everything is too much about money, it's an oasis. And I think you look at the tourist numbers for Japan right now, and yeah, the yen is cheap and all that, but people come to Japan, they're like, oh, you could have this society in which people put emphasis on things working and being nice. And that absolutely 100% comes from the fact that people care about detail and they care about process.
Two stories stand out when you share that. One was from, I believe it was Stefan Zweig. I was reading one of his memoirs, and he talked about when he was studying before the writer, his first assignments were translation. He translated the great works to a point where he basically got inside the minds of some of these great writers and then was able to innovate on his own accord. The other, I worked at one of the consulting firms, and Toyota was a big client, and we would do some like site visits and stuff. And I remember they had like outlines on the desks of where the staplers would go. Like, this is what an organized desk looks like, which I thought was really cool and funny.
Yeah, look, I did an internship in 2000 for this pretty stodgy Japanese company, and I was just like shuffling things around on my desk, going just like of a parody of somebody bored at the office. And then I turned, like, my supervisor turned around and says, David, we do not whistle at this company. And I was just like, okay. Like, I didn't even think about this kind of thing. And so when you're in that environment, you're like, well, this is incredibly oppressive and it doesn't have any impact whatsoever on the bottom line or anything that I'm whistling here. And so there's obviously trade-offs, and also there's a wide variety of experiences in Japan, and you don't want to say that every company is like, oh, we don't whistle at this company. But I mean, there is this, but there's a propensity, there's some sort of orientation towards more of a uh, process over goal kind of way of thinking about things, and it has different outcomes. And I think the outcomes at the moment, it always shifts, but at the moment, having a more analog, process oriented, detail oriented society is just at least makes it a nice place to live.
Well, David, you've been really generous with your time. Before I let you go, what's the best way for people to keep up with you and the work you're doing?
Follow me on Instagram or X. I have a newsletter called Culture and Owner's Manual that I've been very bad about sending because I'm deep into trying to get this new book done. My new book will hopefully come out at the end of next year. It's a cultural history of the 21st century. It's kind of if you've read Amatora, my first book, which is very much chronological history of American fashion in Japan, and then Status and Culture, which is very much a non-chronological, theoretical kind of book trying to explain principles. The new one is much more trying to explain what's going on in the 21st century through a chronological historical timeline and following specific people, mostly kind of famous celebrities, but that hopefully will come out. So I'm very, very busy trying to finish that at the moment, but at some point the newsletter will continue. So Culture and Owner's Manual, it's at culture.ghost.io.
We'll have links to all those profiles in your past books in the show notes. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Tuesdays with Morrisey. That conversation was with David Marx, an American writer based in Japan. What I enjoyed about the episode was hearing what we can learn about Japanese culture and more broadly, humans' relationship with both status and culture. If you enjoy the show, share it with a friend, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks.